It was supposed to be another late-night interview, filled with clever jabs, political sarcasm, and well-timed applause. But what unfolded between Stephen Colbert and Karoline Leavitt shattered every expectation. Tensions flared, boundaries were crossed, and the audience watched as control slipped away from one of television's most seasoned hosts. What happens when a rising political voice challenges a cultural giant on his own stage and wins? Make sure to like and subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. The lights were bright, the band had just finished its riff, and the audience at the Ed Sullivan Theater was buzzing with anticipation. Stephen Colbert, a master of satire and timing, adjusted his tie and glanced at the cue card one final time. His smile was fixed, rehearsed, but something in his eyes flickered with unease. Across from him, Karoline Leavitt waited, legs crossed, posture firm, her expression unreadable. From the moment she stepped on stage, there was a quiet defiance in her presence, not the kind that shouted or gestured wildly, but the kind that dared someone to challenge her, knowing full well they would not win. Colbert leaned in, his voice wrapped in charm and thinly veiled skepticism. "Karoline, welcome to the show. I've been looking forward to this." She nodded, but her response came with a measured edge. "I am sure you have. Why had he invited her? Was it to expose her? To toy with her politics for the sake of laughter? Or did he truly think he could outmaneuver her in front of millions?" The opening question was harmless enough. Or so it seemed. "You're young, ambitious, outspoken. Some would say aggressive. Do you think that helps you or hurts you in today's political arena?" It was bait, the kind designed to draw a reaction, to tilt the table. But Karoline didn't flinch. Instead, she turned, not to Colbert, but to the audience. "Is that the standard now?" she asked. "To ask women if their confidence is a liability? Or is it just a convenient line of attack when the politics don't match the platform?" The room shifted. Applause came, but not from everyone. Colbert smiled, a little tighter this time. "Well," he chuckled, "I was just warming up. Let's talk about your recent comments regarding media bias. You claim shows like mine twist facts and manufacture outrage. Is that not a bit ironic, saying that on a show known for comedy?" Karoline raised her brow, leaned slightly forward and asked plainly, "Is comedy an excuse for misinformation, or just a mask you wear when the truth becomes uncomfortable?" Silence. For a moment, the well-oiled machine of late-night programming stuttered. Colbert blinked, searching for the next line. The cards in his hand, suddenly less useful, dangled at his side. Was this what he expected? A soundbite? A meltdown? Instead, she delivered clarity, and it was cutting. She continued, "You want to have a conversation, Stephen, but are you willing to let go of the punchline long enough to actually listen? Or is the goal always to score the next viral moment, no matter the cost? Why was she here? Was she picking a fight? Or was she exposing one that had been hiding in plain sight all along?" He tried again, this time with more force. "So are you saying people should take you more seriously than me?" "I am saying," she replied, "that people are tired of being entertained into complacency." The audience murmured. Some clapped. Others shifted in their seats. The energy was changing, and Colbert felt it slipping. What happens when the interviewer becomes the challenged? When the stage designed for satire becomes a battleground for substance? He attempted to pivot, shifting to a lighter question about her personal life, hoping to soften the tone, redirect the temperature. But she was not playing by the script. "That's cute," she said with a small smile. "But the questions about my hobbies can wait. Let's finish the ones about truth first." This was not just a disagreement. It was a collision. One between a media veteran who had shaped narratives for years and a woman who came prepared, not to play along. And as the first segment neared its end, the producers backstage hesitated. Cut to commercial, or let it run. Colbert glanced at the teleprompter. His lines were waiting. but none of them fit anymore. She had tilted the ground, beneath him, calmly, decisively. And for the first time that evening, the audience wasn't laughing. They were listening. Backstage, tension simmered as producers hovered around the monitor wall, exchanging hurried glances and whispered decisions. The segment was supposed to be light, amusing, and framed by a carefully plotted rhythm. Laughs, applause, gentle barbs, then good night. But Karoline Leavitt had sliced straight through the plan. Now, with cameras still rolling, the tone of the show was no longer comedic. It was confrontational, and viewers could feel it. Stephen Colbert returned from the commercial break more composed, but not unchanged. His jaw was tenser. The smile remained, but the laughter behind it had faded into something more cautious. Karoline, however, sat like she belonged there, as if this set were her arena now. The studio lights glared off the polished desk between them, but it was not enough to burn away the disquiet. "I have to say," Colbert began, voice cool, "you're not exactly the typical guest. Most people try to win over the crowd." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Is that the goal? To win over the crowd, even if it means losing the point?" The audience murmured again, quiet, shifting, sensing the undercurrent that had turned this from interview to intellectual standoff. Colbert pressed forward, this time steering into deeper waters. "Let's talk about truth, since you brought it up. You've been outspoken about the media being complicit in shaping partisan narratives. But isn't that exactly what you're doing right now? Coming onto this stage and trying to control the perception of you?" Karoline didn't blink. Her voice, steady and sharp, responded without hesitation. "The difference is, I'm not pretending to be neutral. You call this satire, Stephen, but everyone watching knows you have a side. I am simply choosing not to dance around it." The crowd shifted again. Some leaned in. Others crossed their arms. No one was passive anymore. He tried again. "But you're accusing me of bias on my own show. Is that bravery, or is it performance?" She paused, then answered with steel in her words. "It is refusal. Refusal to let polite fiction cover for public manipulation. You joke about politicians while shaping public belief. That is not just performance. That is power, Stephen. And you know it." For a moment he didn't respond. The silence that followed was thick, electric. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying her. "What are you trying to prove?" Karoline's eyes narrowed. "That entertainment has become the last place people turn for truth, and that maybe it should not be." No one clapped this time. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a dismantling or a revelation. Colbert's next words were slower, more deliberate. "I've spent years trying to use humor to make sense of politics. If you take that away, what are people left with? Maybe discomfort," she said. "Maybe that's exactly what they need." This was no longer a clash between guest and host. This was a war of perception, broadcast live before millions. There was no room left for pretense, no space for clever deflections. Karoline had shifted the axis. The narrative wasn't hers to win. It was his to salvage. He cleared his throat. "Do you think people really care? Or are they just looking to be entertained after a long day?" "People are desperate for someone to stop pretending everything is fine," she replied. "They are not numb. They are exhausted." Colbert leaned forward again, now visibly unsettled. "So what? We throw away the whole format? Late night? News? Comedy? Everything?" Karoline met his gaze. "Maybe we just stop lying about what we are doing." Her words were heavy, deliberate, meant to linger. And they did. Behind the camera, the floor manager counted the seconds to another commercial. But nobody moved. The segment had taken on a life of its own, and every person in the room sensed it. What started as a political skirmish had escalated into a reckoning, not about right or left, but about authenticity, performance, and the blurred lines in between. As the music finally rose to signal the break, Colbert remained seated, silent. Karoline did not move either. And the audience, unsure whether to applaud or hold their breath, simply waited. The moment the cameras cut to a commercial break, the bustling chaos backstage was palpable. Colbert's usually confident demeanor had slipped. Producers rushed to him, offering quick notes, their voices drowned by the hum of monitors and the low buzz of the crew. But Stephen barely registered the rush of words. His mind was still reeling from the conversation with Karoline. What had just happened? Was this the moment his late-night show was shifting into something else entirely? For a brief moment he wanted to retake control of the narrative, to press a reset button on the show and pretend like the last few minutes never happened. But the truth had already been laid out, raw and unsparing, on that stage. The audience was different now. They weren't just there for laughs. They were engaged in a conversation, and Stephen knew it. The next segment began, but the tension between him and Karoline was unmistakable. He forced a grin as the cameras came back on, but it felt thin, fragile. Karoline sat across from him, still poised, still calm, but now with a hint of knowing victory in her gaze. The fight wasn't over, but the battle lines had been drawn. "So," Colbert began, his voice carrying the weight of a man trying to reclaim some ground. "Let's get back to the facts. You've criticized late-night shows like mine for playing a role in shaping public opinion, but you're on one now. Is that hypocrisy? Or do you just think the game is rigged?" Karoline's expression didn't change, but her eyes flashed with a hint of something sharper now. "You want me to admit hypocrisy? To concede that I'm part of the same system I'm calling out?" she asked. "That would be easy, wouldn't it?" The audience, still captivated, leaned in. Colbert looked taken aback, unsure of where to go next. But what if the real hypocrisy is pretending that all of this whole spectacle, isn't an elaborate distraction from the real issues? What if it's not just the politicians who are manipulating us, Stephen, but the very format of shows like yours? She spoke the words deliberately, each one landing with precision. For a brief second, it seemed as if the energy in the room shifted. The edge of discomfort Colbert had been trying to bury surfaced again. He leaned forward, trying to cover the crack in his composure, with another quip. "So you think it's all a conspiracy?" "No, Stephen," Karoline responded smoothly. "I think it's a carefully curated illusion. And I'm asking you to see it too. People watch shows like yours thinking they're getting a dose of reality. But how much of what you say is really truth? And how much of it is just the punchline? To the next big joke?" Colbert's brow furrowed. "Are you saying that we should stop trying to make people laugh? Because if that's the case, you're in the wrong place." Karoline's gaze softened, but her tone didn't. "Not at all. I'm saying that comedy should challenge the status quo. It should not reinforce it. You want to make people laugh, Stephen? Fine. But don't pretend it's the same thing as telling them the truth." The silence that followed was suffocating. Stephen's usual easy repartee was nowhere to be found. The audience sat in rapt attention, sensing the gravity of the exchange. Was she right? Was humor the last refuge for people who were too afraid to face the hard truths of the world? The pressure was building. This wasn't just an interview anymore. It was an ideological standoff, broadcast live for millions to witness. It was clear that the dynamic had shifted, that the control had slipped from Colbert's hands. He was the one being challenged now, and it was a challenge he was struggling to face. "Are you accusing me of misleading people?" Colbert asked, his voice barely a whisper now. "That's a bold claim." "Not misleading," Karoline replied, calmly. "I'm asking if your intentions are truly as pure as you make them out to be. The media, the late-night hosts, the news anchors, the pundits, they all play a part in the narrative we live in. And sometimes that narrative does not serve the truth." The weight of her words hung in the air, and Colbert was visibly shaken. He had made a career of blurring the lines between fact and satire, using comedy to tackle serious issues. But Karoline's words made him question whether that blur was always innocent, or if sometimes it was more dangerous than he realized. "You don't think comedy has any value in politics?" he asked, trying to reframe the conversation in familiar terms. "It does," Karoline said, her voice unwavering. "But when it becomes the only way we process the truth, we stop asking the important questions. We stop holding people accountable." The audience, once divided in their loyalty to the comedian they'd tuned in to watch, was now being forced to reconsider their stance. They weren't just watching an interview anymore. They were witnessing something that felt like a reckoning, the collision of entertainment and reality. For the first time in years, Stephen Colbert didn't have all the answers. The final commercial break had ended, but the atmosphere in the studio had changed irreparably. What had started as a playful late-night banter had transformed into something raw, more intense. Karoline sat across from Colbert as calm and composed as ever, while Stephen seemed to retreat further into himself. He had lost control of the interview, and the reality of that loss was settling in. Colbert tried to mask his discomfort with another quip, but his usual charm no longer carried the same weight. He cleared his throat and looked into the camera, regaining some semblance of his old self. "All right, folks, I think we can all agree that Karoline here is challenging everything we thought we knew about late-night television." He gave a half-hearted chuckle, but the room wasn't buying it anymore. The audience shifted in their seats, some nodding thoughtfully, others furrowing their brows. Karoline's words had landed hard, and the viewers could feel the shift in tone. This wasn't just entertainment anymore, it was something that felt like a revelation. Stephen, now sensing the need to regain control, leaned forward. "So, let's be clear, Karoline. You're saying that late-night TV like mine is part of the problem. But what's your solution? Just to shut it all down?" Karoline's gaze never wavered. "No, Stephen, I'm not saying to shut anything down. I'm asking you to reconsider the role you play. Is your show really about enlightening people, or is it just about keeping them comfortable?" He stared at her for a moment, trying to hold on to his usual cool composure, but it was slipping. The joke was no longer working. The setup and punchlines didn't fit the growing tension between them. Karoline wasn't playing by the rules of the game, and that rattled him more than he wanted to admit. "You think comfort is the enemy?" Colbert asked, trying to find footing in this increasingly unfamiliar terrain. "Comfort," Karoline replied, "is the shield that lets people ignore the hard truths. People are so desperate to laugh at the absurdities in politics, they don't question them anymore. They don't even think about the consequences." Colbert faltered for a split second. This wasn't supposed to be the direction the conversation had taken. His entire career had been built on making light of serious issues, offering a cathartic release for an audience too weary to confront the complexities of the world head-on. Karoline was making him confront the uncomfortable reality that perhaps, in doing so, he'd become part of the machinery that prevented real change. Karoline's words were sharp, direct, and hitting too close to home. "You tell your audience to laugh at the news, Stephen, but they're not laughing because they think it's funny. They're laughing because they don't know what else to do. They've been conditioned to laugh, to escape the pain, the confusion. It's easier that way." Her voice held a quiet intensity, but it cut through the noise like a blade. It wasn't just an ideological clash anymore. This was a reckoning, and Stephen Colbert was on the defensive. "You're wrong," Colbert said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "People need comedy. They need the chance to laugh at what's happening in the world. Without it, what's left? Just the crushing weight of reality?" Karoline met his frustration with unwavering calm. "Maybe that's exactly what people need, Stephen. Maybe they need to stop laughing and start asking the right questions." The weight of her words settled over the audience like a blanket. It wasn't just Karoline challenging Colbert. It was the entire framework of late-night television being put under a microscope, exposed for its role in shaping public perception, for its tendency to mask reality behind humor. Stephen was no longer in control of the conversation, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't have an easy way out. The crew was silent, the cameramen still, waiting for the next move. But this wasn't scripted. There was no prompt for Colbert to lean in with a sarcastic remark or throw to another skit. This was raw. This was uncomfortable. This was real. Colbert, for all his wit and cleverness, was at a loss. "You think people are just numb?" he asked, almost pleading for a response that could justify his world. "You think they don't care about the issues?" "I think they care," Karoline answered, her voice quiet but firm. "But they've been distracted for too long. They've been pacified with humor and entertainment instead of being pushed to engage with the truth. That's what needs to change." For a moment the studio was utterly still. The show had lost its rhythm, and in its place was something far more complicated, an unraveling of everything Colbert had built his career on. The playful jabs, the witty retorts, the carefully curated moments of levity. They no longer mattered. The audience, who had come for a late-night escape, found themselves caught in a deeper conversation about what comedy had become and what it should be. Karoline had shifted the narrative, and now Stephen had no choice but to confront it. His mind raced as he searched for a way to turn the conversation back to safer ground. But with each passing second, it became clear. Karoline had won this round. The truth she had laid bare was undeniable, and Stephen was left to pick up the pieces of his own show's long-standing facade. As the final few moments of the show approached, the air between Karoline and Stephen was thick with an unspoken tension. The conversation had shifted in ways neither had anticipated. What was supposed to be another routine late-night interview had transformed into a moment of profound reflection, one that carried a weight neither could shake off. The cameras rolled, but the energy had irrevocably changed. Colbert, still reeling from the barrage of Karoline's piercing insights, took a deep breath. It was as if the weight of her words had settled into his very bones. He had tried to play his usual role, the witty late-night host who could diffuse any situation with a clever joke or a quick jab. But this time, there was no easy escape. The conversation had forced him to confront his own part in the media landscape, his own role. In the illusion of late-night humor, Karoline sat across from him unflinching. She wasn't here to entertain. She wasn't here to be a punchline. She was here to make a point, and she had made it forcefully, unapologetically. There was no arrogance in her demeanor, no gloating, just the quiet strength of someone who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to speak it. Stephen finally spoke, his voice softer now, as if the facade of confidence he'd built over years of broadcasting had crumbled piece by piece. "So, Karoline," he said, his tone not quite as confrontational as it had been earlier. "What now? If people are so distracted, as you say, what do we do about it? How do we fix the system?" The question hung in the air, a stark contrast to the usual witty banter that had defined late-night television for decades. The audience, who had been drawn into the back and forth, was now fully engaged in the moment. They weren't just watching a debate. They were witnessing the unraveling of an ideal. The concept of what late-night TV could, and perhaps should be, was being called into question, and Stephen Colbert was on the receiving end. Karoline's response was deliberate, each word measured and thoughtful. "I'm not here to offer some quick fix, Stephen. The change I'm talking about is deep. It's about the responsibility we all have to engage with the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about shifting the focus from entertainment to empowerment, empowering people to ask the right questions, to demand more from their media and from their leaders." There was a pause as Colbert absorbed her words. It was the first time in the entire interview that he didn't have a response immediately ready. He was silent for a moment, searching for his usual quick-witted comeback, but none came. He had been forced into reflection, and it had shaken him. For years, he had been the one to guide the narrative, to control the flow of conversation, to make people laugh at the absurdity of it all. But now, that control had slipped away. And in its place, he found himself standing in front of an uncomfortable truth. "You're right," he said, the admission coming slowly, almost reluctantly. "Maybe it's time to start asking different questions." For a moment the room was still. Karoline didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply nodded, as though she had known this moment was coming all along. The audience, who had watched the entire exchange unfold, seemed to recognize the significance of this rare moment of vulnerability from one of their favorite hosts. Colbert, his eyes meeting Karoline's, spoke again. "Maybe we've all been too comfortable, haven't we? Maybe laughter can only take us so far before we have to face what's really happening." For the first time in the entire interview, Karoline allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of recognition. The battle for control had been fought and lost, not by her, but by the very system Colbert represented. And in that moment, it felt as though a long overdue shift had begun. As the cameras prepared to sign off, Colbert turned to the audience, his voice tinged with a new sense of humility. "Well, there you have it," he said, the usual light-hearted tone now absent. "Tonight's interview didn't go quite as planned, but sometimes that's the point, isn't it? Sometimes the best conversations are the ones we didn't expect." And, with that, the show began to wrap up. Colbert, still processing the weight of the conversation, glanced over at Karoline one last time. "Thanks for coming on, Karoline. It was different," he said with a half-smile, though his eyes revealed that the conversation had affected him deeply. Karoline stood and nodded, her calm demeanor unchanged. It was a conversation worth having. As the credits began to roll, Stephen Colbert, for the first time in years, didn't know exactly how to end the show. But perhaps, just maybe, that was the most honest way to finish it.